What's up, guys? I figured I'd share the journey of getting started in Ruby on Rails and becoming kind of a novice developer, front-end developer, designer. A lot of businesses and companies already are using it. A lot started with it. Twitter, for instance, or GitHub was on Ruby on Rails for a long time. The same is true for Shopify. Stuff like that is all written in Ruby. And Ruby is a really approachable language for a beginner developer. So I really enjoy the cleanliness of it, I guess, compared to something like PHP or JavaScript. It's definitely almost magic how things work, but they work really well. So this is just an introduction to that, and I wanted to kind of invite you on board, follow along. The next part of this will be kind of getting familiar with what you need to run Ruby on Rails on your system, depending on if it's a Mac or a PC. I'll kind of walk through at least the Mac portion. That's what I primarily develop on. The biggest and probably the most hardest step to getting started with Ruby on Rails is actually installing it. If you're on a Mac, chances are you have Ruby already installed on your system. But to get started on installing Rails, it's a good practice to kind of follow a guide. There's one that I would say is probably the most up-to-date, called Install Rails on installrails.com. It's brought to you by the people from 1 Month. To start, let's go ahead and just dive in. Assuming you're on a Mac, you can follow along with me. If you're on a PC, there are alternative steps to take, and it will actually tell you which way to go here. So on a Mac, you'll want to actually make sure your versions, at least up to these current versions. 10.6 is pretty old. I'm using the latest MacBook Pro. I do have Xcode installed. You don't necessarily need the whole Xcode app. If you want to install just the command line tools, you can do that too. I think I have Xcode. What was it? I can't remember the actual key command right now, but I have it installed. The easiest way to do it is just go to the App Store, install Xcode. You need their command line tools to do a lot of things that we'll need to utilize in the coming steps. Going forward here, it's talking about the command line, and you can use the built-in one. I like to use one called Hyper. It's at hyper.is, I think. Hyper.is. Yeah, and it's based on JS, HTML, and CSS. I used to use iTerm too, but this one just kind of has been on my radar. So you can use whichever you want. And going back to this guide, you can open your terminal, and it's just kind of giving you a quick run through of, hey, this is what a terminal can do. A big thing I like to utilize is Homebrew. I actually have it installed. If you want to install it, you can head to Homebrew's page, or there's just a script you can run here. If we run brew v, I should get Homebrew 1.3.4 is my current one. There's a key command you can run called brew doctor. Might as well run it. Just kind of checks everything out, make sure it's up to spec. We'll run that real quick. Cool. So by the way, I'm working in a directory just on my desktop called sites. I just created that right before the screencast, so nothing special there. Git is obviously important. It's a version control software. Basically, you can create snapshots of your code and later reference them if you need to, and or create branches that are different features. So branches are saying, hey, clone this app, and I want to do this to it, but keep that other screenshot the way it was. So I think I have Git installed, but I might as well check first. So we'll do Git. I do it. All right. So 2.14.1 I think is my latest. If you're new to Git and you're just installing it for the first time, you do need to create global user parameters. And Git is not the same as GitHub, so don't misconstrue those. It's actually something that stays local, but you can add GitHub as a remote thing that you can push your local stuff up to. I'm already set up, so I won't go through all of that. Installing Ruby, you can do globally. just like anything else, but it's very, very, I guess, advised to use a Ruby version manager, and that's what actually RVM is in this case. I tend to use one called RVNV. I'm just saying that for short. It's the same thing. It's just kind of done differently. So we can install the latest. Let's see what versions we got. 2.4.2. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I do RBNV, it's hard to remember. Install 2.4.2. Cool. So we're at this moment downloading Ruby 2.4.2. This takes a bit, so I'll probably speed this part of the video up, but just make sure you do this step because you don't want to use the system-based Ruby version. It's too outdated for Rails 5.1.7 or whatever it is now, I said. 5.1.4. So while that downloads, I'll speed this video up. This finally installed 2.2 to our versions on our RBNV directory inside my actual user directory. So if we do RB, I'm probably saying this wrong, but that's just how I say it. If you do versions, it should show 2 now. And what we want to do is set that 2.42 at this point. So what you'll type is RBNV global 2.4.2. And then we'll do one more time. I'm hitting the up key to bring back the history there. RBN versions, and it's set. So we're all square on the Ruby front. Cool. All right, next, to get Rails to work, we need to actually install it. So you can install it with the actual gem, and Ruby gems are similar to something like npm if you have ever used Node. It's basically the same thing. I would say Node copied off of the gem library. If you Google Ruby gems, it should, I think I have that URL wrong. Ruby gems. There's a whole site dedicated to these, and they're basically like these awesome plugins. There's plenty of potential out there to go ahead and build an app of your wildest dreams. So with that, Rails is actually one of them. So you can Google Rails and you'll see it here. It's 5.1.4. It's the latest. If you just want to add this to your project, you can do it like this. It goes into this file called a gem file, which we'll get into. Just install it verbatim. You can do it like this. The guide here is actually kind of cool. It's basically installing Rails without some stuff we really don't need, like documentation and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same on our installation. Just paste that into the terminal and hit enter. All right, as you can see, 37 gems had installed for Rails to kind of work. We can check if Rails is indeed working if we go to Rails version. So I have Rails 5.1.4 installed at this time. If you run into issues, definitely look into this stuff. If you're following along using the same in Ruby Manager as me, there's a lot of documentation here. Definitely recommend Homebrew if you're not using it. It will make your life easier if you do on a Mac for sure. At this point, we've got Rails going, we've got Ruby installed, and then the next step, let's see, just install code editor, and we can create our first app. This is going to be me walking you through how to create a simple blog-like structure using Ruby on Rails as the CMS and the actual creation, edit, and deletion of posts of a typical blog. I'm using such things as like Bulma, which is a CSS framework. You see all these styles are kind of adapted from it, but this is the basic app we'll be building, and you can create posts, read posts, and actually comment on posts too. So here's what a post could look like. And this is all without any kind of user accounts. So in future lessons or videos, I'll be actually creating a user admin kind of side of this. So where if you were an admin user, you'd have, say, these controls, but if you weren't, you wouldn't see that at all. So we'll be going deeper into that in future stuff, so stay tuned for that. But this is just kind of to get you started with Rails and Ruby, and to get your palette adjusted to how things work with it. It's a little, I guess, hard at first to understand if you're new to Ruby and Rails, but it's essentially we're working with an MVC pattern on this web app framework known as Ruby on Rails, of course. This I have running. This is what you'll be building. It's the demo app, which is on GitHub, and I'll share that in the link or the description, etc. So when we get to that point, this will be what we make. I'm going to probably do some copy and pasting in the sense of styling and maybe some HTML markup, just because it's going to save you some time. And the point of this series is to just learn Ruby on Rails. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. I have this server running, our demo app already, and it kind of looks like this in my terminal. I'm going to go ahead and Control C out of that. And it's called on GitHub demo blog Rails. And I did kind of a one pager of what we're actually doing here. So it's like I said, it's a blog to demonstrate Ruby on Rails with posts and comments. So the main features will be obviously posts and comments. For the comments, we'll actually do that. It's going to be create, read, update, destroy, or a CRUD pattern for posts. And then comments, it'll be create, read, and destroy. So if you author a comment, you can see it obviously, but user can also delete it, but they can't edit it. There are these things known as gems in Ruby on Rails, and these act as kind of like a node package manager kind of scenario. Very, very similar, but we'll be making use of these as I go through. And these are basically out of preference for myself, but also just stuff that is a time saver later on. There's a thing known as guard that helps with tons of tasks behind the scenes. If you're used to like grunt or gulp or something like that, it kind of works like that. But we'll use live reload for our Sass and any changes to our JS or ERB files, otherwise known as HTML files in this case. And then there's like a better errors gem and one called simple form, which makes authoring forms in Rails pretty darn easy. So this will all be accompanied with a blog post. So definitely, look to that for these code snippets, but also this is all on GitHub. So I'm going to back out of this project, the demo app, and actually create a new one. We'll just call it demo blog. So I'm going to do Rails. Well, let me make sure there's not one in there. Yeah. I'm going to do Rails new demo blog. And that should generate everything we need there. And run bundle, which will install all of our gems. So with that installed, we can go ahead and cd into that demo blog directory. ls there. So those are all the files and folders in our directory. By default, Git is initialized, so that's pretty cool. If you want to go ahead and version this, definitely start now. Everything that is ignored should be ignored, but you can also ignore more files if you want to. That's just how it comes out of the box. I probably will just go ahead and do that just to make things. I'll just run git init and git add. So git commit init show commit. Cool. All right, and then I'm clearing that using Command K. If you're new to the command line, you can also type clear and hit enter, and it'll do the same. Okay, so first what we need to do is verify our app's running. So we can just do Rails server, and this is a good practice just in case your environment's not set up correctly or something's off. This is going to go away and turn into this, which is the screen you should see if you installed Rails correctly. All right, so with Rails installed, we need to get our mindset around this app and how it works. There are things we need to configure that make the routing work right. And to get things kicked off, I'm going to actually generate what is known as a controller. So I'm going to keep this server running, and I'm actually going to create a new tab in my terminal, Command T and hyper. I think it's the same in iTerm and probably your default terminal app. If you're on a Mac, of course. So I'm going to I have an alias set up for that sites directory, which is just my desktop sites. Cool. You need to cd into our actual app again, so demo blog. And here I'm going to I'm going to install the gems we want first. I think that's a good starting point. So let me open this in Sublime. Here we go. And I have the actual blog that I showed you first behind it. So I'm going to minimize that because we might reference it later. Just for some quick HTML stuff that we used, which you can basically just grab from the Bulma website, which I'll get into. So by default, that seems huge if you can see it. These are the gems that install with Rails. Most of them, I mean, you make use of Sass Rails, of course. Puma is required. SQLite is definitely required for your database. You can make that any other type of database if you want. We'll get into that in future videos. And of course, Rails. Again, I talked about this in a video a while back, so definitely check that out. But what we want to install are these gems that basically make our life easier when working with Rails. I'm going to reference a file real quick. One for sure is called Better Errors, and we'll actually do that. I mean, it could be in the development group, I guess. But I'm going to put it here just for now. So we'll do gem Better Errors. And I'm referencing a file. What you should do isn't this and just type it in because it's a pain. But I'll show you what I end up doing most of the time. Here, T24. Okay, so we have better errors. Okay, cool. So that's obviously you can comment here and just say make errors better looking. By default in Rails, if you get an error, it's this big ugly mess of red stuff, red fonts, red fills and stuff like that. Better Errors just looks better and gives you a little more data of what's going on. And that should be gem. Okay, so you may be wondering, okay, I'm never going to remember, this. I'm never going to, figure out where that's going to be. So there's a site called Ruby Gems, which conveniently enough, our gem file actually references. If you look at the very top, let me go to it here. Its source is from rubygems.org. So definitely a good site to, keep in your back pocket. So we'll go to that site. And as you work with Rails, you start to find gems that you're just your go-to. So don't think you're supposed to know these offhand. But as you see in other apps, they could just kind of come throughout when working with it. So here is the best place to find the most updated version. Definitely recommend doing it the gem file method and not install on your system, because then you're stuck with it on your system. And this is more of a gem file per project approach. So your projects will vary based on what you're building. So definitely keep that in mind. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in just for safety's sake. The next one I want to use is called Bulma. So I'm going to do a search for Bulma. And I always look to kind of see which one has the most downloads. Usually that's the best candidate. So I'm going to copy that. Go back to our gem file, add it. We'll call it Bulma CSS. And Bulma is like a lean down modern Bootstrap kind of CSS framework. I like it. You don't have to use it. You can use Bootstrap. You can use Foundation, whatever you want. Simple form is our next one. So I'm going to go to, and in most cases, you're probably going to install these not all at once and have your mind made up already. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and install them all. It's probably best to install each as you work forward instead of just all at once. So the next ones are going to be Guard and Guard Live Reload. There's quite some configuration with this one. It's kind of hard to understand at first, but they do have repos that you can reference for the how-tos. And on Ruby Gems, if you go to the homepage or the source code, typically it's, the best place to go. The GitHub repos tend to be the most up to date, so I definitely refer to those. And this is guards, for example. So we'll actually put that. This one's kind of special. We only need it in our development environment. So Rails has a specific group that classifies that as the environment here, and we'll actually put that in there. And you don't need to add these comments at all, but typically, just for my own, sake, I'll copy kind of the one-liner that they give at rubygems.org and throw it in there. And then the main reason we need guard is this guard live reload extension. That's what I primarily use it for. Guard is capable of so much more, so don't let me sway you in thinking that it's just for this. Guard live reload, search for that. There it is. So I'm going to install that. And I'll do the same thing with the description. All right, so we've got I think all the necessary gems that I need for this particular project installed. Gems are kind of going to be your savior in a lot of cases, as you'll come to find. Things like user accounts, user roles. There are so many out there that are great for handling that stuff for you. I definitely Google that stuff, just kind of get familiar with the process. And we'll definitely touch on those more in future videos. So stay tuned, of course. Next, since we have those gems installed, we need to run this thing called bundle, which actually goes out and fetches that data for each. So we're going to install everything we just added, and you'll start to see those names now over here, like simple form. Let's see, guard should be there. Yeah. So you'll see them now. It's part of a dependency in the project now. So that's great. When I do that, I tend to kind of restart my server. So if you do Control-C on a Mac, you can just kill your server and then run Rails server again. Okay, so for some of our gems, there is some setup required. I'm going to go to the simple form one and do that one real quick. And I'll never remember how this should be, but if you refer to the repo, like I said, that's the best place to figure out how to do this setup. It gives you kind of the idea here. But like I said, this gem isn't up to date. I mean, it would fetch the latest version, but in your project, you might need a specific version. So that's why rubygems.org is a thing. So definitely use it instead of these repos. So we need to run this generator for this to work for this specific gem. This is the simple form gem. And I'm going to actually go to my other tab on my terminal. I'm in that. Actually, let's do a git add gems. Simple as that. Okay, so we need to next run that generator, which is Rails generate simple form install, and I just literally copied and pasted from that repo. If you are using Bootstrap or Foundation, it comes out of the box with support for those. So up to you if you want to. I'm going to show you how to use this CSS framework called Bulma. And it is essentially more or less a modern take on Bootstrap or stuff like that. It's got really cool style, look, and feel to it. So I just figured I'd give it a shot. It's actually my first, more or less my first time using it. So there might be some Googling and stuff that I'll have to do to figure some stuff out in terms of class names, but definitely check it out. It's based on Flexbox, which is nice. With that installed, we can go ahead and bypass these flags to install Bootstrap and Foundation. We don't need those. We'll run the generator, do simple form install, and it should do its thing. And it just gives you a feedback saying, hey, you can rerun this if you want to use Bootstrap or Foundation. It's the same thing I just told you. So we should be all set. There's no migrations to run or anything here, so that's great. Next, we want to configure guard, and I've actually got the write-up of how to do it. If you go to that Ruby gem site and then go to guard live reload, you can link to this. It'll show you what to do. We actually need to, I just noticed I need to add this require false on that gem file. Right there. And I'm going to actually turn on word rep. I actually need to run bundle one more time. You're going to find yourself doing this a lot. Okay, and for safety, we can do this again. If you just hit the up arrow, Rails S again. Great, it's running. You can verify it in the browser. We're good. Okay. One thing to get guard live reload initialized is to create what is known as a guard file, and that's part of using guard. And I should preface all of this and say you don't need to use this stuff. It's just useful if you want your browser to refresh automatically when you do style changes or something like that. You can configure it to do more based on whatever file types you use, like HAML, Slim, JS, YAML, etc. So it's pretty useful in that regard. So one thing we need to run after that gem is installed and configured, as shown here, is guard init live reload. And it might throw some warnings at you. It's okay. Basically, all it did is create a guard file with some specs in it. So we'll go back to our project, and you'll see this new file called guard file. So it should be actually set up out of the box, so that's great. This stuff, I know it looks confusing, but it's basically just, it's finding directories in your project and watching them as they change. So there's some kind of, what's it called? I forget now, but specific keys and file names and structure and stuff like that to watch and update your project as you save, basically. So with that all set up, one more thing we need to do is make sure you have the actual browser extension installed. If you go to livereload.com/extensions, it'll give you links to each. I'm using Chrome, so I'll actually install this in the web store, I think. All right, so I already have Live Reload installed, so no need to do it on my end. If you don't, go ahead and install this extension. I believe it's available for almost all browsers, so it will make your life awesome when you actually install it and use it in Ruby on Rails. So switch over to our terminal, and with everything essentially okay, we should be able to run bundle exec guard. And that specific command is there because we need our dependencies. If you don't run it with bundle exec in front, it won't notice that you're using certain dependencies. So it's kind of a long thing to remember, but guard is essentially the command line key term that fires things off when you're using guard. But in our case, we need to run it as is, and it'll just kind of do its thing. So once you run it once, it just sits there and waits for stuff to change. So at this point, we can, make a new terminal window again and go back into our sites directory, and then go back to our demo and, go to town. So at this point, we should have everything installed. And we can verify that by first creating our very first controller. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let me get this out of the way. Since we're using a blog, I'm going to do a posts controller. So to do that, we need to generate G, or you can type generate here too, controller. And if you're very, very new to this and want to figure out what this stuff actually does, you can do the flag help when you do generate controller, and Rails will spit out kind of what you can do, what you can configure on the fly. There are options to skip things if you don't want them to be generated, like JavaScript or the assets at all. You can use a certain template engine and not use the default ERB, so that's kind of useful. But yeah, so read into that. If you just type the flag help after a lot of things. It will give you a lot of insight that it wasn't so, I guess, understandable by me at first, but until I read that stuff, it made more sense. So let's just do this. Rails generate controller, if I can spell controller, and we'll actually call this, I'm going to do capital, I'm going to call it posts. It should be plural for the controller. So for your models, which we'll get into, keep those singular. Just remember that. So by default, you can have what actions could be on this, like index, show, edit, create, etc. I'm going to go ahead and just leave them off for now because we'll actually type those in so I can show you exactly how this stuff works. So we'll just do the basic generation of posts. And as you can see in the controllers, it will generate this file called post controller RB, and the view posts folder, the test stuff, helper stuff, assets. Like I said, you can flag this stuff to not generate. I tend to just run with the flow and just generate it and delete it later. That's just me being lazy, of course. So, all right, so let's again open this in Sublime. So in our app directory, we're going to find our new post controller, and this is all it generated by default. So to show proof of concept, I'm going to create an action called index. And one more thing to get this to work is to create a view called index. So you go into your views folder, your posts folder, and then create index.html.erb. But for now, I'll do just h1. I think they use class title. And then we could just put index, log index. So finally, if you were to visit the site, okay, it's still working. And you can go to posts, and then we'll see that. But we actually need a route first. So that's why we're getting errors. And I noticed bundle, or my better errors gem isn't working, so that's interesting. All right, guys, I can't get, for some reason, this better errors gem isn't working for me, but it should look like this on their repo, and it's kind of mind-boggling. But what I did though I mistakenly added it to the basic gem repo, but we needed it in our development environment, so I put it down here for now. So if it were to work, go ahead and put it there. Make sure you do, because you don't want that in production. So anyway, it's okay if we don't have it, but that should be working. It might work for you, and it just isn't for me at this moment. So okay, so we're still getting this error that when we access the posts controller we made, there's nothing there, and that's because there's no routes set up. So we actually need to set that up in our routes config file. So go to in the config folder, routes, and then we'll just do this thing called resources, and then posts, and that should be it. But to make things a little easier so we don't have to navigate to /posts in the URL, I'm going to go ahead and put a root parameter and change that to index or posts index. Okay, now that should do it. When you do update your routes file, you probably want to restart your server yet again. So we'll go do Rails S and go back to that. Refresh, and there we go. We got our blog index, and that should be all set. All right, guys, it took some time and got this stuff working, so never fear. On your end, it should work if everything's set up correctly, of course. But I got the better errors thing to working, and to just prove it, I went to a post that didn't exist. So it's working there. And then I noticed when I went to my post index, I was like wondering why my CSS wasn't loading, and that's because I was getting ahead of myself, and the Bulma gem requires you to import the Bulma style sheet in your application CSS. So I'm going to go to Ruby gems and go to that homepage real quick just to show you by example. So we'll go to Bulma and Bulma Rails and go to the homepage. Should take you to a GitHub page. And the main thing I forgot is when you import it, you need to actually import it into the main style sheet of the project. So I'm going to go do that. And we're going to use Sass by default. It's going to be a CSS file in your style sheets. Go ahead and rename that to SCSS, and you should be able to use Sass right out of the box. So there we go. And I'm going to just import that Bulma CSS there. I think we have guard running. We need to. So bundle exec guard. Okay. So if I save that again, which it's not really, I'm going to set this as syntax. Let's do CSS. I guess I don't have Sass support for some reason. That's great. Okay, so back to our blog. Watch the type hopefully update here. Give it a second. There it goes. Okay, great. So we know, basically verifying that our CSS is loading. Okay, so now that we have our initial index action created and our view index created, we know that things are working. We've got our routes set up in our config file. If you go to config routes.rb, and you should have these things in here. So great, we're ready to get rolling. So what we want to do is kind of configure the actual way this is going to work. So there are other actions we'll need to include on our controller, but the main one I want to start with is the create action. We need a form to create a blog post, right? So let's go ahead and do that. And first, to do create, we actually need this action called new, and then def create. Okay, and we actually need some data to work with here. So this is where models come in, and I'm going to actually generate one right now called post. So let's go back and make a new tab. And go to my sites again, cd demo blog. Great. And I'll actually do Rails generate model and call it post, capitalized. And I'm going to give it these, basically what I call them data types. And it's just basically the things that get entered into the database. And you can name them, but you also have to tell the database what kind of data type it is. So in this case, for a blog post, I want a title, and it's going to be a string type of data. And we also are probably going to have, you know, content within that blog post. So I'm going to do text. So text is like a long form text. So think of it like that. So you can add as many as you want to a model like this, but you can also append things later with these things known as migrations, which we'll get into. Let me bump up the size if you're having trouble there. And when running this, it generates our model. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so you'll see it created a migration in itself as part of the model process. So in this, if you want to see what a migration looks like, you can go to your project, and there is this file called, or this folder called DB. Inside of it's a migration folder, and inside of that is the migration we just created. Rails is pretty smart. By default, it does the time stamping, so you don't have to worry about dates and stuff like that, or like, you know, created at kind of stuff. That's already included by default on pretty much any model or migration. And here's those things we entered as tables in this sense. At that point, we can run what is known as rake db migrate or Rails db migrate. And that will set that up in the database for good. And you can roll this back We'll hopefully don't have to do that in this video, but we'll get into that later on if you need to. So for good sake, I'm going to add, message, add post model. Okay. So at this point, we should be able to interact with that model itself. We need to basically add it to our controller in such a way that we interact with the model. So you'll see in our app directory, we have the model post created. Shouldn't have to do anything at this point. We will later when we add comments to this thing. So don't worry about that for now, but we will interact there. But our main source of work right now comes to this controller, the post controller. So let's go ahead and we can reference this post by doing that. And essentially we're calling that post model now, and we can say, hey, we want a new one. The create method utilizes the new route. So if you are confused about routing, since we added that resources parameter to our config file, or routes file, I should say, if you run rake routes, it'll spit back all of the basic CRUD actions for the post controller. So we have post index, which is like the index page of the blog, create, which would be where you would go to create, or the action that takes place when you create a blog post. New is the actual path you take to go create. Edit, of course, is to edit. Show is to just view the individual blog post. Update is to edit it. It does kind of that. You can do different types of updation. Updation, is that a word? Updating. And then, of course, you can delete it. So that's kind of explaining that. At any time, if you run rake routes, Rails will spit back all of your routes in your routes file and kind of the URI pattern and the action involved. So it's super, super helpful. So going back to our project, that kind of gives you the sense of what these actions are and where you're going to be going when you create a new post or something of that nature. When we create a new post, we actually need to do post and do a similar fashion, post.new, but we need to pass in the parameters that we use to create the post. And you could pass those in right in line like this, but you're going to find that you're going to be reusing this in other actions. So there's this private method you can add to your controller file that allows you to create this thing, post params. And if this isn't making sense, that's okay. I was lost when I first started this, but the more you do it, the more it makes sense. So here we're requiring for our model these specific records or tables, whatever we generated in that migration. And this is kind of a security feature of Rails that only permits these things from being actually input to the form we do when we create this record. If they aren't initialized here, you can't actually submit data to the server. So that's kind of a security thing. So what we're really doing in this case is passing this function into this new creation method here. And then we can check to see if that post saved. And then if it did, we'll want to redirect to the post itself. Else, render the new template again. Okay, so at basic form, we're ready to create a new post in this sense. So if we go to Rails new, we're going to get an error simply because I don't have the template yet. So it needs a template in our views folder. So if we go back to our views, go to posts, new file, new.html.erb. And we could just, for now, just do a class title. So that should at least load that page now. Great. To create the form we need, we are actually going to I'm going to copy, I'm referencing another screen right now, but I'm going to add some markup that we need for Bulma plus our form. So let me do this real quick. I might speed this up so you guys aren't bored. Before I do though, this is where we're getting that simple form gem going. And essentially Rails has a built-in form builder. It's just almost just like this, but simple form kind of obviously simplifies the process. So it's one that I find pretty useful and makes more sense for stuff I do. You're welcome to use the Rails way. Theirs does tons of stuff too. So it's just a matter of preference, I would say. So I had to experiment with Bulma to get this to work, and I had to do a little extra code outside of simple form. The whole intent of simple form is to eliminate, I think, the amount of markup you have to provide. I'll walk you through this stuff in a second. Wrapper, false, label, HTML, class, label. So that's one input field, and that's going to be for our title. And the way this works is you reference the actual record here of the input, and that Rails is smart enough and simple form is smart enough to know what that means. Here we're classifying actual class on the input field itself, and we need input in this case for Bulma. We don't want the wrapper. By default, simple form puts its own wrapper around the input field. And this was causing errors with Bulma because it had a similar class. So there was clashing of styles, and I didn't want that. So in simple form, you can put a wrapper false declaration, and that will help. And then our label HTML, we needed a class of label. So I went ahead and added that too. So this is one field in the sense for a form. I'm going to create a copy of that and paste it down. And this one's going to be for content. And we actually want this to have a class of text area according to Bulma. And label HTML, we should be set there. Then the last thing we need is our button to submit the form, of course. So f.button, and then submit. And this is built into simple form. See, that's nothing we created. I'll just put create new post. Oops. And class button is primary. And that's part of Bulma as well. So if all works, we should have our styles set up. Yeah, there we go. So that took some trial and error, but I got it to basically work for us. So that was pretty nifty at the time. Yeah, and we'll get into cleaning this up in a second in terms of making this look like our first app I showed you at the beginning. But let's verify this works. Test post content. I should get an error, I think. Yeah, so there's no show method right now or action in our controller, and we actually need to have that. So let's set that up. So I'll go back to my post controller, and we need to create an actual show action. Def show end new line. And on the show, we need to find the post that was created. So if you do post dot find params ID. So we're finding by the ID. And we'll be reusing this line about 3 more times. So at the end, I'll show you a way to kind of make use of a before filter or action that allows you just to kind of have that set in stone. You only need to write the code once, just kind of a really dry approach. But for now, just to show you how things work, this is what we need. So in that sense, if we head back, we should find that we need now a show template. So let's go to our post folder again, create a new file called show.html.erb. And we can just, I don't know, what did I have in my markup here? Quite a bit of stuff. So Probably just do section. I don't know if I have. Yeah, I do. Okay, great. Container. For now, I'll just put the title and the content. And Rails, if you're new to it, this is kind of the general way it looks. So you can do Ruby inside these brackets and percent signs. If you want to echo it out, put the equal sign. If you don't, and you want to just perform some operation or set a variable, you can do that there. You don't want to do too much magic inside those. It's more so for just displaying the data, so keep that in mind. So here we have reference to that post symbol, and we can just target the title that we created. So I'll just create a class. I think Bulma has one called content. And I can do the same with the content type. So the controller is sending this data through to the view, if you can think of that. So that's how we have access to this post property, or symbol as they call them, and that is shown here. So if all goes right, we should be able to see that data. There it is. So that gives itself an ID. If we go back to our posts index, we'll see the index. Let's clean this up a little bit. So our index, we can do a section as well. Let's see, section. Then I have container. And that sets basically a max width and boundary for our project. I created, for Bulma, I created these, it looks like cards on the front end. So I'll go through this with you. For our index, we actually do need to set a new variable or symbol on our project where it gets all the posts. So I actually want this to be plural instead of post in this case. So we'll go post all and then order. Here you can just establish how it's displayed in the back when you do loop through all of the posts. So order descending. And notice in Ruby you don't need ugly semicolons and all that stuff. That's why I really like it. It's really clean. So going back here, now we have access to that posts symbol. So we'll go ahead and reference it. And notice I'm not outputting this loop. I'm actually creating what is a Rails loop at this point. But we'll do .each do post. I said Rails, it's a Ruby loop, excuse me. And then we can loop through each post. So the Bulma way goes like this, at least the style I chose. So bear with me here. Okay, so with the markup in place, that should do it for us. We need to add support for the post title. And to do that, go back and do post.title. And notice here, since we're looping through, we don't need this to write the symbol with the @ sign in front of it. We're using this as the variable throughout. So something to keep in mind when you do loop through things. So it's just post.content, post.title. And comments we will add later. For now, they'll be, let's see if I can just comment that out. Comment to comment. Vermet at each. Oh, I did that wrong. It should be posts. Boom. All right, so there's our first post. Great. Going one step further. Obviously, I can't click that post right now. I'd want to click it to go to the actual individual post. So to do that, instead of just the title here, we'll make use of that, but we want to do a link to in Rails. which is a handy, basically href generator with a ton of properties. And then we'll actually link to the post itself. And again, this is one of those rake routes situations. If you're not sure where to link to, this is, where I got that from. So here, now it's a link. We can link to the post. Great. All right, so I think next I'm going to add general links to, kind of navigate this blog a little easier. So I'm going to actually pull up my other project and get the layout file open. And the layout file is kind of the global source of truth for your styles. This is where all your content gets fed through. This yield sign is everything we've been creating so far. All the stuff gets fed into that and spit out. So I want to actually add this content to our layout, and I'll talk you through it. And this is just kind of a time saver, so don't think you need to learn every bit that I'm teaching you here. But let's see. So most of this is Bulma, and here I've created a section class called Hero. If you go to the Bulma library, there's a whole section on that. Let's see, Hero, and there's different snippets you can use. I use one that's basically, let me find it. I think it was this one here, but I eliminated this bottom row of links because we only need really one or so in this project. So let me go back and show you how that worked. We have our hero section, the hero head, the nav bar itself. In it, I didn't create a logo or anything. It's just text that says demo blog. And we're using a link to a function we just use in Rails and linking to our route path. You notice the path extension doesn't come when you rake routes, but that's just kind of an understood path that you can pull from each route. So we can get posts path, or new post path, or edit post path. That's something that you just kind of learn as you go. It's not so obvious, sadly. So let me go back to the project. And we're giving it a class navbar item for the sake of Bulma. And then we added a link on the end of the nav on the right side, which will link to a new post path. Again, adding that path at the end. And that will allow us to go to that new URL path. And then here I'm doing something nifty where you can actually, for each of your views, you can specify something in your layout file using this thing called content for. And I'll show you how that works right now. So essentially you can set the variable here, but define it in your views. So when you hit that view in your URL path, that updates based on whatever you set. So to make that make more sense, I'll do this one right. So it's called content for, and then I set it as page title in our layout file, and this one I just want to call index. So if we head to our index page, you should see that new layout form, and then our index thing is set, our index title. And going back to the layout once more, it's called page title. So on each of our views, we'll actually need to add something of this nature. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for all the views so far. New create new post. If you don't add this, it will error out. So it will be pretty obvious what views you don't have it on. Okay, so with this setup, we can go create new posts, and that we just set. And then we'll actually need to do it on the show view as well. But in this case, we need to actually have a variable set for it. So let me copy that back. And you don't have to use a string. You can do post.title, and then it will render the same way. So let's go back to our root, go to this, and the first post title should display there too. We have it displaying twice. I'll probably get rid of the one down below. Okay, great. Now that we have that set up, why don't we tackle how to, say, edit a post. So let's go back to our post controller, and to edit we need to actually have two actions. One's called update and one is called edit. Edit is the view we'll actually render, and update is the actual method that will actually take place. So I'll go ahead and create def update and def edit. So update, we need to find our post again to know what to update. So we'll do the same thing as we did for show, params ID. Should do a server-side check to say, hey, if the post has been updated, let's redirect the user to the post itself. So we'll do, again, post params. We're pulling that in from the bottom here. So we're doing that double verification check if the form has since updated. And then we want to redirect the user to the post itself. So in this case, we'll write that, else render edit. Great. And then for edit, we actually just need to find the post again. So post, see how I'm repeating this? I'll show you how later on to make this not so repetitive. Great. One thing we will need to do, which we'll get an error for, is to actually, let me add to the view first so I can show you by example. So let me pull up my other view on the show page and kind of walk you through what I did there. So this one, we have the page title, we have our section or container, and there's this thing from Bulma called level. Class level. Oops, can't spell. So on the left side, I'll pretty much just follow what I have on the repo. Left side, div class, level left. P class level item. And then this, it's just kind of a placeholder because otherwise the actions weren't floating to the right like I wanted. So a little behind the scenes fibbing there. Right side are where the actions really will be. So these are going to be like the edit and delete buttons. So we'll do P class level item again. And inside this, we'll have a link to our actual edit action. Link to edit, we'll just call it edit. And then this will go edit post path. Notice it's all dynamic based on the actual model and mention. We do need to pass the post through to it though. So that's something that's new. And then we can give it a class of button. Okay, and then I'll come back to the delete one, but for now we'll add that. So another link to. In fact, I'm going to leave this. I'll just put delete for now. It's not going to do anything though. So I'm going to just hard code this, but it's a to do for sure. So button is danger. because delete's a little complicated on how it works, because there's some data interactivity needing to take place within the browser. So we'll get to it. Nav, and then I had just a horizontal rule, and then we have our content class again. I could have left that from before, but we'll just do that. So we need our @post.content. Render that. Okay. And later we'll add a section for comments. For now, I'm going to leave that as is. Okay, so if all goes right, we should be able to edit this post now. And we're missing the template, so we actually need to create that. So it'll be edit.html.erb. And in our case, I'm going to make this a little more dry. And one thing we absolutely need for sure is content for, and we'll pass in page title again from the layout. And we'll just put edit post. But I also want to, since edit and create kind of use the same form, we might as well make use of the same form instead of reauthoring that entire form again. So I'm going to actually render what is known as a partial. And this is how you do it in Rails. And I don't have it created yet, but I can. So in posts, again, in the folder, views folder, I'm going to create one. Make sure it is underscore at the beginning. That's how Rails knows what it is. I'm just going to title it form.erb, html.erb. And if I go back to my new file, I'm going to copy and paste this in. Actually cut it from new, paste it into form, save it. And for edit, I have render form already. I'm actually going to copy and paste this and put it in the new file as well. So we have essentially our partial and the title for the page in these views. Okay, so if all goes right, we should see our form and the content within it on this page. Rails is smart enough to kind of know that that's an edit and update kind of scenario, so the data gets fed through. So that's pretty nifty. We can probably tweak that button to say, let's probably get rid of this text. Actually, this will probably be wrong in the repo, but that button text needs to change dynamically, so this needs to say update post. Yeah. So that's Rails being smart again. So I'll just hit update and it redirects back to the post. So great. We have our editing functionality in place, and to test it, I could do test post content with an update. Update. There it is. And if we go back to our homepage, there it is. Cool. So the last thing to think about is, okay, this delete button. We need to make sure that's even possible. Probably don't want to always have posts on your site that you can't delete. So let's get back into our post controller, and we'll need one more action called delete, or destroy in this case. And we need to find the post once more. So we'll do find params ID, and then we can just put post.destroy. And that's essentially how it gets deleted, but we actually want to redirect the user to the post path. So in that case, it would be the index page. We could put root path there too, but I'm going to do post path. Okay, so in our view, here's where it gets a little complicated. We'll go back to the show page, and that to do I entered comes into full force now. So we'll actually need to do another link to, and make sure you get the equal sign. Okay, and then we need to pass in the post path itself. So there's no actual delete or destroy post path. That's not part of our routes. That wouldn't make sense. So we're just getting the post path with the post ID, and then our method on it will be delete, and it's typed like this. And then you can, tap into the browser functionality and access the confirmation window, which is typed like so. And then I want the Bulma classes on this as well. So we'll do button and then is danger. Okay. So our method is the delete method on this post. We're getting its ID, and then we're confirming with the user, because you don't want to just delete it outright without that kind of gateway in between. So let's verify that that works now. So here's our "are you sure?" and then delete. And now we're at our index page with no posts. So let's create another one just to make sure everything's working. Second post. Create. Then it goes to the post. Cool. Third post. Great. And there they are in line. This is our root path. This is our create path or new path. And we go back to the show path, which is getting the ID of the post. Then we can edit the post and update the post and delete it. So great, that's essentially the functioning part of the blog. So we've gotten that far. Most blogs have comment forms though, so we want to actually add that to our view next. And to do that, we need to generate both a controller and a model for comments. So let's go ahead and go back to Rails, or I'll actually do git add finish of posts. I don't know, posts. This is the hardest part, I swear. Okay, cool. So we would need to create one more controller called comment controller. I'm going to actually do Rails generate controller. Let's just call this comments, and we'll just leave it at that. Okay, and I'll just do the model too. So Rails, let me clean this up. Rails generate model, and let me verify 1 second what I created. So yeah, we need a model called comment, and its title or its name of the person commenting would be a string, and the comment would be text. I ran into the weird naming issue that, like, the comment thing, it kind of gets confusing later on, but I'm going to keep it as is just so it's consistent with what you guys will see. But you might change that name to something different there. You'll see what I mean. So let's run that. And you can verify that that migration is in place in our DB folder again. Let's create comment. There it is. So we still need to run migration. So Rails DB migrate. After you run that, you should create those tables. There they go. Okay, great. Now we can interact with that. The first thing I'm going to do is go to our models. And this is where relations comes into play. A post is going to have many comments. Rails has tons of documentation on this if you want to read up on it. It's really important to understand, but it's very basic how it works. So that's why I really like it. So if we could do has many comments. but a comment's going to belong to a post. So we'll do belongs to post. Notice this one's singular and this one has many. So that relationship is basically established just like that. So we do have a comments controller now. We should only really need our create and destroy methods on this one, since it's going to be showing on the show page of our posts. So let's do a create. Oops. And destroy. And it gets a little confusing because we need to have that, relationship between these two models now. So we need to first find our post. But we need to find it by the post ID. And that's something we haven't talked about yet, is migrations. And one thing that isn't quite established between these two models is an ID. Usually there's a relationship based on ID between them. So we need to run what's known as a migration at this point. And then we will do Rails generate migration. Let's see, add post ID to comments. So if we run this, hopefully Rails is smart enough to know what we're after. But we're taking the ID of the posts and putting a new table on the comments model. So those IDs, when they're basically, related to, can have something of relation. So the ID is how that works. It's kind of confusing, but we'll see what happens in our migration here. So we go to migrate and our latest one. So it didn't actually, sometimes it automatically does this stuff for you, but unfortunately it didn't. So you might need to add this yourself. And the way it automatically does it is how you type it, but we won't get into that, I guess, now. So we need to add a column, in this case, to comments. And then it's going to be post ID and of the type integer. So we'll close that, and we need to run one more migration. So Rails db migrate. And it should add that record to our column. So now we have, that column comments on comments, which is post ID, and it's an integer. So if all goes right, we should be able to access this as if typed. And we also need comment to find the comment on the specific post. Comments, create params, comment, and then we can permit, instead of doing that private function, we can just type it in place like this for the strong params that Rails needs. And we need to close that. And then once that's good, we can redirect to post path post. Okay. So here we're finding the posts based off of this variable or symbol we created. Once we have that, we can get the comments on it and go through that comments model and then create the new comment on that post. It's kind of tricky, kind of hard to understand, but that's essentially what's happening. So let's first verify that that works. I'm going to go to my show file and I'm going to make that form. So when we have an actual comment form here, we should be able to see the name and the field to type the comment in. So let's go to views, layouts, post show. Okay, so I have that div from before, or that section I should say. I'm gonna go ahead and do a container. I'm gonna call this section 2. That's part of a spacing thing in Bulma. Subtitle. I just applied various classes here to kind of design this without actually doing custom styles. And here we need to at post dot comments dot count. So here we're getting the posts comments count, obviously. And we could just type comments here. Before I go on though, since this record, the records that we have don't have this stuff associated with it, it's going to error out if you don't have some of this stuff like the post ID. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these, and then we'll add fresh ones. And I can talk about how you can do this without the interface, because sometimes Rails will throw up an error screen and you can't access the UI. So I'll show you how to do that. It's called Rails Console. And you can essentially just interact with your database through the command line. So next we want to render comments. Post.comments. Make some more room. There we go. And that will essentially be our comment feed. Next is the comment form. And I just added a horizontal rule, h3 with a class subtitle, and is3, just the sizing class. You can leave a reply. And then we rendered an actual form, which we still need to create. Great. So it's going to error out, obviously, because we don't have the form. We actually need to create a new post, though. So let's do, I don't know, I think I'm on my fourth post. Fourth post comment. And boom, missing comments form. So we need to create that in our comments folder. Let's do a partial, that's a form.html.erb. And then in this file, it will be using simple form again. And then it gets kind of tricky here, but I'm going to grab, make sure we close it. So to make this a little easier, I'm going to grab the content from within this form, and we'll just change the parameters. Oops. And this will be name, and this will be comment. Okay, so save. Inside the simple form 4, we need to pass in both the post and the post comments. Let's do post, and at post.comments, and then this thing called build. And this confused me too, but build, I have a definition here. It says it returns one or more new objects of a collection type that have been instantiated with attributes and linked to this object through a foreign key. So it's kind of how we have the post ID on the comments. We're getting that post reference from it, and then you can update that form and get that data from that thing. It says it also only works if an associated object already exists, so it can't be nil. So that's why I deleted those records, because this stuff would error out otherwise. I think that's it for the form. Let's verify that it'll pull through. And then we have post path. What am I missing here? All right, guys, after quite some time trying to figure this out, I realized immediately when I thought about it, finally, a big gotcha is that to do what we're doing, we need to actually edit our routes file. So comments needs to be within it. And I totally forgot about that. So let's go back to that and actually fast forwarded and try to do some more code here for the destroy method to see if I just had something wrong. I'm gonna delete that for now, and then we'll get it in the next part after I get this crap working. So let's fix that. And then I'm going to go into my routes file in config. Let me close these. The comments are nested within the scope of posts. We actually need to create a block with Ruby here and do end. And then inside here, we'll do resources for comments. This is only for nested kind of things. Most cases, if you're having completely new routes, you'll do just similar like we did to resources posts. But in this case, we're doing it this way. So since we edited our routes file, I'm going to go ahead and restart my server. Let me clear out of here. And we have it running. I'll do Control C and then up arrow, hit Rails S again. So now if we do, actually I'll stay on that view and go over to this here, and I'm gonna do rake routes just to show you what I mean. So since they're nested, you'll notice how it works. It goes posts and then the ID and then comments, and there's no just immediate comment route. So when they're nested like that, that's how that works. Pretty simple. Okay, so let's go back to our code editor and actually have the demo app that I had built previously up, just trying to troubleshoot. And let's go back to our comment file on our app, views, and actually the post show file is what I'm after. I have the render comments form showing. So we should be able to, at this point, see that form up here. So yes, it took me too long to figure that out and I feel bad for it. But anyway, with our controller set up and our data models, related, we can now leave a reply. I'm going to go ahead and just put any reference. This is my first comment. Leave it. And we're missing a partial that is what the comment would spit out as. So it's kind of like the show view of our comment that will render once that happens right here. To get that, we actually need to create a new file called comment, but I'm going to make it a partial. So underscore comments.html.erb. And I'll reference another file I created from before. And this one I'm going to use a box class from Bulma. And inside that will be an article. And it's going to have a class of media. And we'll have a class of media content. And if you don't have emit installed, that's how I'm doing this dot notation. Really recommend it on whatever code editor you use. Kind of a lifesaver. So you could just do P and strong. Inside that, we'll have the comment name. And I'm going to actually put colon and then the comment itself. And here's where I mentioned naming convention before, and this is why it's a bad one, because I'm referencing the comment model with the comment data type, so it's confusing as hell right there. So definitely maybe use like something different than me if you're following along, but for learning purposes, it's not a huge deal, but just know naming conventions are huge. And if we want to delete this, it's very similar to the one we did on the post. So I'm going to go ahead and type this one out, do a link to delete. The only difference here is we're referencing that post again. So we need this bracket notation and then also the comment ID to make sure we're referencing the right record. So we'll do a method of delete and then a class again. Button is danger. Oops, danger. And then we actually need this data confirmant window again. This is just essentially hacking our browser. And there are ways to work around this. Say you want to use a different modal to ask this "are you sure" kind of question you can do that. That's something I won't be touching on in this video series, but it's a workaround. You need some JavaScript to kind of tie into the whole structure, but you can essentially, like, say, use a Bootstrap modal or even Bulma's in this case to do this. All right, so with our comment partial posted, we should be able to render this comment now. Post.comments, missing comment builder. Why is that? Oh, I think I named it comments. Yeah, it should be comment. Sorry, guys. So make that singular. Save. And kaboom. All right, so there's the comment. We have a delete button. It doesn't do anything yet. It does this data thing, but it actually won't go back to the server and say, hey, actually delete this. So we need to actually create that next. But essentially, hey, comments are working. So that's cool. To do that delete method, we'll need to go back to our controller, our comments controller, and we have that destroy method, And here, again, we need to access the post, find it, I should say. So we do post find params, and we need it by the post ID since we're in the comments controller. So through the comment, we are finding the post associated with it, if that makes sense. And then we need to also find the comment to destroy. So post.comments.find, and then the params of the specific comment. So it's just basically the ID of it. And then we'll actually destroy it. And we'll redirect the user to the post path. And this actually needs to feed that post symbol in so we know which one to go to. And that should be it for the destroy. So let's make sure that works. We'll refresh this, delete this. Are you sure? Yeah. Great. So we're still back on this post and it's all working. You'll notice that the URL has an 8. I've added and deleted records just to trying to troubleshoot along the way. So you might notice that that happens to you. To do that, realistically, sometimes your interface goes to the error screen. So if you wanted to, say, do that from the command line, which is probably the way you should, you can do this thing called Rails console. And there's a ton of documentation on it, but you're essentially running a Ruby command line that's embedded within the terminal in Rails. So we can access our post model if we want. So say I'm just creating a variable here, post equals post. It'll actually ask you to do this weird connection thing. So just do that and forget about what it does because it's pretty easy. But clear that, and then you have post, and then just say post.all. And you can see all the posts on your current model. And here's the one I was showing. It's post with an ID of 8. It shows me the title and the content. So if you want to actually manage this stuff, you can do post, I don't know, dot equals post dot find 8, since that's the ID there, and it'll come back with that same one. If we wanted to say post dot, since we assigned it to that post, we now just have that post handy as the variable here. It keeps outputting. I want to update that title, so let's say post dot title, and then we'll do an equal sign. This is a post updated from Rails console. Then it spits it back. You still need to save it, so remember to do that. So post.save, there you go. And then if we navigate back, if you want to just exit this, you can go exit. So if we navigate back to this post, it updated. So that's essentially a way to interact with your database without having to do any crazy UI stuff. I think it's the pattern that most developers go with, simply because it's straightforward and you can access it without any errors. So you'll notice right now there's no user accounts or anything like that. Any user can access this blog and delete it and edit it. That's not very secure. In a future video, I'll probably talk more about user accounts, how to implement those and make sure certain users can only have read-only access and other users can have writing access and deleting, editing, all that stuff. One more thing before I forget, on the controller, I mentioned how we repeated a lot of stuff. And this line in particular, we repeat here on show, we repeat it on update, on edit, and destroy. We can create another private definition here. So we'll call it actually find post, for instance. And essentially just keep that line in there. So I'll just copy and paste it. Oops. Great, so it's there now, and we have access to it basically for all of these methods and actions. So Rails has this handy thing called the before action that you can initialize before anything happens on your app. So we can just define it as before action and grab that method, and then on it we can only queue it in for an array of these actions. So for instance, I only need it on show, update, update, edit, and destroy. So what that does is essentially means I don't need it now for let's see, edit and show. Show can just be empty. Update, update can get rid of that line. Edit, I can leave it empty, and destroy. So that really cleans up our code. It almost makes it look like it shouldn't even work, but it does, and that's awesome. So we have that available to us. You can do before actions for other things like authentication. You can even do things such as making sure your app is secure. Like when you do enter certain criteria on your model, you can actually tell it that it should validate in some way based on the server response. I'll get into more of that as we go on, but that's essentially without any security right now. We have a working blog with comments. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you're just getting into Ruby on Rails, I am as well. So don't consider me a pro, but I've certainly studied up on it. I've been building a side project on the side using it, and I figured I'd share the wealth and try to teach others so I can better learn myself. So more is to come. I hope you enjoyed this again, and thanks for watching.